Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're coming towards the close of the course, but there's one major event we still have to deal with. It's the Civil War. Now, we're not going to talk about the events of the Civil War, and we're not going to talk about the why and the how. You're going to deal with that in discussion. You're also going to look at a guy named John Brown, who, it's not that he's the seminal figure, it's that he really helps us understand the extreme fringes on both sides of this issue. What I want to look at today is compromise. How people compromised, how people tried to prevent war from occurring, and how they were unsuccessful. But we need two maps. So pause me, put them on the other side, take out your book, and I want you to flip to page 258 and 407. Do it now, 258, 407. I'll wait. You got it? Get your map, get the book. Okay, you got it? Good. All right. Starting on 258. Our first event of four, Missouri Compromise, 1821. We see the map here. You've got a situation where Missouri applies to become a state. That's how you do it. You form a government in a territory, you apply to become a state. It was set up in the earliest kind of form of government under the Articles of Confederation. Well, the problem is, Missouri wants to become a slave state. Now, normally this wouldn't be a big deal, except for the fact that that would make one more slave state than free state, which means that the slave states would have more power in the Senate, because, of course, 2 senators per state, right? So, the North didn't want this. There was an outcry. They would mess up the entire balance of power. Um, this this tension and fierce political debate waged until our kind of compromising hero, Henry Clay, comes on the scene. We're going to talk about him again. You've heard of him already in terms of his relationship to Jackson. Um, he comes up with a plan. It's called the Missouri Compromise, right? Uh, Missouri will come in as a slave state. Also, the top half of Massachusetts will be split off of Massachusetts and become a state of itself. We now know it as Maine. It was part of Massachusetts at the time. Um, the other part of it is that they would draw out the 3630 parallel and call it the Missouri Compromise line. You can see it right between Missouri and the Arkansas Territory on your map. That's the line we're looking for. Um, it passes, and the important part is this 3630 line, this Missouri Compromise, was seen as a sacred agreement. It was seen as an agreement that could never be changed. It was a thing that would keep peace. And it did. It's going to keep peace for years. 1821 all the way up until, well, frankly, 1848. You are not going to have problems because everybody looks to the Missouri Compromise line and say it's okay. Below the Missouri Compromise line, there will be slave states. Above the Missouri Compromise line, there will be free states. That's it. That's the answer. All right. Well, 1848, what happens? Flip in your book. See if you can't find it. That's right. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Um, it's that treaty that ended the Mexican War. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Um, well, the problem with this is not that, well, the problem is we got more land. So actually flip to your next map. Flip to 407. And you will see that now, all of a sudden, the country has the New Mexico Territory, the Utah Territory, California, they've got Oregon, Nebraska, Kansas. There's all this land. And the Missouri Compromise doesn't really address all of this. So all of a sudden, the same question, which had been dormant for, well, 26 years, is now back in people's faces. And they don't know what to do about it. They come up with two different proposals. One is to take that 3630 line, that Missouri Compromise line, and extend it all the way across to California, which California's a free state, and no one really denies that. The other is to do popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is when a territory forms a government, the government will debate it, and then they will decide whether the territory will be free or slave. Okay. This gets into a huge debate People are constantly debating. They're going back and forth. Nobody can really come to the problem. California wants to be admitted as a state to the Union. Of course, they want to be admitted free. There are no slaves out there. So they don't know what to do. In the midst of this, Henry Clay will die. He draws up a compromise, but dies before he can push it through. John Calhoun, this person who you're reading about, who's the great defender of the South from South Carolina, he dies. These two guys who are fighting against each other. At the same time, you are going to have Taylor, the president, will die in the middle of this. They will all kind of die in the same period of time. They're all old. It's not that big a deal, except for the fact that these are the last great leaders of this second generation. Remember that second generation we've been talking about through the era of Manifest Destiny and Market Revolution. So now you have a third generation taking over, and it's up to them. In fact, it leaves up to a guy named Stephen Douglas to come up with this compromise and push it through. And he does. We call it the Compromise of 1850. It's got four major parts. First, California will be admitted free. No one denies that's going to happen. They're going to divide the rest of the territory up. So they'll divide Utah and New Mexico into two different sections, split by essentially the Missouri Compromise line. It's not exactly, but it's the theory of it. And in those new territories, there will be popular sovereignty. So it's kind of combining the two ideas. Now, alone, those things wouldn't go through. Those two ideas wouldn't go through. However, you put a couple carrots on this. Third, the compromise agrees to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This was a big contentious thing for abolitionists and for many Northerners, actually many Southerners too. Right down from the White House. You stand in the front of the White House, you look down the street, there is a huge slave auction, a huge auction block right there. And when foreign dignitaries come in, especially English and French who had abolished slavery worldwide in their territories, this doesn't look good. So, get rid of that. I mean, it's not going to hurt anybody. People can just go just to the outside of D.C. about a mile and buy a slave. It's not an economic thing, it's an image thing. The fourth part is a fugitive slave law. And this is what pulls in the Southerners. It says that if your slave runs away, and he runs to the north, you can go get him. You can ignore any laws. You don't have to go through a judge. You don't have to go through a jury. You don't have to go through a sheriff. You essentially have bounty hunter rights to hunt him down and take him back. Which means that slaves escaping to the north were no longer free. The only way to be free was to get all the way to Canada. That's a different story. And this fugitive slave law will be strictly enforced. So anybody who finds or comes across a fugitive slave legally, including sheriffs, have to hold them until somebody comes to get them. So you can see both sides are getting a little what they want. They compromise with the West. This is a tough political fight, but he gets them passed. The problem is, many believed in 1850, that we're going to teeter on the edge of war. That the U.S. will be right on the edge of the war and is barely able to pull it out with this compromise. But more importantly, this is the beginning of this new generation of political leaders in 1850. I mean, we had the first generation coming out, the Constitution, and, you know, our founding fathers, or framers, if you will. You got that second generation coming in the 1820s with Jackson and Clay. But now in 1850, we're on to that third generation. They were not privy to the revolution or the early struggles of the Republic. They grew up in the age of Manifest Destiny. They grew up in the age of factories. They grew up in the age of King Cotton. They have a very different mindset. All right. We got two more events we need to handle to be continued.